I'm CJ Werleman, and this is episode 14 of Foreign Object. This is the podcast where highly relevant guests share their opinions. And let me tell you this, opinions are not like assholes, for I do not wish for anyone to stick their finger in my opinion. That joke made a little bit of work. This may come as a shock to you, but many of your opinions do not arrive by accident or even self-discovery. They came because a special interest group somewhere working on an agenda for someone spent millions of dollars preparing a white paper, of whose manipulated and massaged narratives were dropped into the media and retold as facts. The Islamophobia industry does exactly that. And oh yeah, you bet your sweet ass there is such an industry. There is indeed those who profit greatly from disseminating fear of Muslims. One of the first studies into radicalization post 9/11, for instance, was funded by 4 private foundations: the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Neoconservative Project for the New American Century, and the Center for Security Policy, and the David Horowitz Freedom Center. For each of these neoconservative pro-Israel groups, their agenda was to root terrorism in religious ideology rather than in the political interaction of Western foreign policy and the Muslim terrorist groups. It's from these very neoconservative groups that many new atheist and neoconservative writers get their opinions and forecasts of a Muslim tide from. My guest is an expert on this topic. Nathan Lean is the author of The Islamophobia Industry, How the Right Manufactures Fear of Muslims. He is also the research director at Georgetown University's Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. And I welcome Nathan to the show. How are you doing, mate?
Hey, thanks for having me, CJ.
Yeah, mate, great stuff. So, I guess the first question is, what is Islam? How do you define Islamophobia?
Islamophobia, I think, is best defined as the prejudice towards or discrimination against Muslims on the basis of their religion or religious identity. A lot of people have defined Islamophobia in the past using the word fear. Obviously, that's a result of the suffix of the word phobia. But I think today when we talk about Islamophobia, we talk about it in the same way that we talk about other forms of prejudice, which are, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and those things as they play out in the public square, in the public sphere, are, I think, more related to the way that these minority groups, be they religious minorities, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, or others, are treated by society at large.
And so when someone like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or any of the prominent new atheists will say, "Oh, but come on, Islam isn't a race, and it, therefore shouldn't be immune from criticism." How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, they're taking a sort of very literal view. I mean, of course, Islam is not a race, but I think it's sufficient to say that religion forms parts of people's identities. It's not just this set of ideas that you have in your head. It forms a part of who you are, how you see the world, how you see yourself, how you see others. And so I think that because religion is in many ways a part of identity, a very important and integral part of identity for a lot of people in this world, we begin to enter into an area where we're through Islamophobia attacking people's identity in some ways, and I think that's the part of the debate that they often miss out because they're sort of overly focused on these sort of petty arguments like, well, Islam is not a race, and so that gives us freedom to attack Muslims and shield ourselves of the label of racism or racists.
Yeah, indeed. That's kind of been the basis of my argument back on that as well. I mean, race has always been malleable. It's something that's always been constantly shifting, and depending on historical and political moments or movements at the time, for instance, in the United States, Arabs were considered white, pretty much right up until 9/11. And anyone who suggests that the anti-Polish sentiment in some parts and pockets of Western Europe isn't, rooted in bigotry or racism, is, really deluding themselves. And I really believe it's a cop-out used by cowards to hide behind very bigoted attitudes towards Muslims. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Yep.
the unfortunate thing I think is that, at least in the United States, there's a tendency for us to kind of shy away from conversations about race. They're uncomfortable, they're things that we just don't like to talk about, and race is one of them. But the reality is that if you look at a lot of the groups and a lot of the individuals that are behind sort of these ugly displays of Islamophobia in our society, the reality is you don't see a whole lot of racial or ethnic minorities in those groups. I mean, look, let's face it. Most of the groups are comprised of individuals who are white. They're sort of part of the white elite majority that exists in the world. And, apart from that, if you look at, just sort of some of the rhetoric that comes out of a lot of these groups, I mean, a lot of it sort of zeroes in on Muslims, but, there are references to, for instance, Barack Obama, and the idea that Barack Obama is sort of a secret Muslim or a closeted Muslim, I think plays, very closely to the fact that the individuals are sort of upset that there's, an African American that's the president of the United States. And so, for instance, the recent rally that was held in Garland, Texas here, you had, sort of rowdy bunch of white Southern individuals with, assault rifles and guns show up to an event where Muslims were meeting inside, and they held up these signs that say things like, Muslims, get out of our country and take Obama with you. And apart from that, I mean, we have data that has looked at hate crimes that have taken place, and we see that there are strong racial elements involved. It's why Sikhs are attacked. When Sikhs are misidentified as Muslims, they're misidentified based on the fact that they either have beards or their skin is, a bit darker in shade, but these are sort of the identifiable traits that people latch on to. And so in a way, Islam has been racialized. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and they'll. I've heard some people, particularly new atheists, make the argument, oh well, it's like communism. It's an ideology. You can't tell a communist from one another. Well, communists are generally, unless they're Chinese or white, Russians. There's very distinct social, less distinct social indicators and or markers than you have for Arabs or Muslims. And I guess where it gets into dangerous territory as well. I mean, Arabs, they're a Semite people, so I can't see how it's not, akin to how Islamophobia isn't akin to anti-Semitism when Arabs are Semitic people.
Well, absolutely, and I mean that's you've touched on a number of important points here. I mean, one of the things that is sort of, I guess, baffling to me is that a lot of sort of the fiercest Islamophobes are quick to say, oh, well, I'm not a racist because Islam isn't a race. But then, when the argument is that Islam is a religion and so I can criticize it, they seem to sort of shift into this other mode of, well, Islam isn't really a religion, it's an ideology. And so what happens here, CJ, is these sort of Islamophobes in the world keep moving the goalpost, so that they create a situation where they're always, able to criticize Muslims for one reason or another. You mentioned anti-Semitism, and I think that that's a really important thing to bring up, particularly right now. There are a number of things in the news, I think, that remind us of the strong parallels between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I think none more so than the recent protests in Germany, the Pegida movement. This is a group whose leader recently had to resign. The Pegida movement, for your listeners who may not be familiar with them, is a mass movement, a mass group of individuals, upwards of 25,000, that have been marching in the streets of Dresden and other cities in Germany, essentially protesting Islam. They're an anti-immigrant group, but all immigrants are not equal. It's the Muslims that they're really concerned with, and that has to do with sort of the demographics of Europe and the fact that there is quite a bit of Muslim immigration in Europe. But at any rate, the leader of this group, the Pegida group, had to resign after posting a picture of himself on the internet dressed up like who? Adolf Hitler.
I saw that.
Yeah, and so here you have the leader of an anti-Islam movement of sorts resigning because he has dressed up like Hitler. Why on earth, CJ, anyone would want to dress up like Hitler, let alone dress up like Hitler and post a photograph on the internet of yourself, inviting all sorts of controversy? And, I think it was just a very sort of telling moment that revealed sort of a lot of, or, I should say it revealed a lot, sort of the ugly underbelly of this group in Europe.
Well, and the problem is too, they're not protesting Islamic extremism or even Islamic terrorism. They're protesting against Islam itself, and that's where the bigotry, I believe, comes into it. And for example, what I want to ask you when you're touching on Pegida in Germany is how worried or concerned are you with the rise of this very anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim movement in Western Europe? But I mean, particularly as these economies are spiraling, and history has taught us that whenever economic conditions turn south, it's always the last off the boat who cops the blame, or the ones who are least able to defend themselves. How worried are you, concerned of increasing violence, a la 1930s style? Do you think, the sins of the past, and I'm talking about the Holocaust, is that too far-fetched to draw a comparison?
Well, I think it's a bit far-fetched to suggest that something along the lines or the scale of the Holocaust could ever happen. I certainly hope that we would not begin down that path again in our history. But I think what is true is that in light of the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo, in light of the rise of groups like ISIS, in light of continued acts of terrorism carried out by individuals who happen to be Muslim, we have seen Islamophobia increase substantially in Europe. Now, the interesting thing, though, about Europe is that there are a whole lot of other factors at play that make it different from the United States, different from Canada, different from other places around the world. Factors mainly dealing with, as I mentioned a minute ago, immigration. I mean, this is a big debate in Europe. The immigration of immigrants from Muslim immigrants from North Africa and from various other places in the Middle East. But what is troubling, I think, is that in light of these attacks, in light of the things like Charlie Hebdo, we do see such a resurgence, a strong resurgence, not only politically in terms of rhetoric of far-right European politicians like Geert Wilders, who may well become the next prime minister of the Netherlands, a virulently anti-Muslim figure, with a long laundry list of very hurtful and hateful statements about Muslims and Islam. We see also, the rise of, as I mentioned, groups like Pegida in the streets demonstrating. But I think the consequence of this, in terms of Islamophobia, is that in France, hate crimes against Muslims over the past 3 weeks have increased 110%. 110%. That's incredible.
It's astonishing.
And we're talking about vandalisms of mosques, graffiti, mosques being firebombed, pig carcasses and pig heads left on the grounds of local mosques. We're talking about attacks on people, attacks on, for instance, Muslim women in public, being assaulted simply because they're walking down the street wearing, for instance, the hijab or the veil. They're clearly identifying themselves as Muslims. Other people recognize that sort of identifying symbol and attack them on the basis of nothing more than their religious identity. And that's kind of to circle back to what I was talking about earlier with, Islam forming a part of your identity. I mean, it's sort of a sad state that we've arrived at, I think.
Yeah, and I obviously, I too believe something, akin to the Holocaust is far-fetched as well, but where we're headed, and I mean, you only have to look at the experience of Muslim Americans now at the moment. I mean, Muslim Americans since 9/11 are kind of living to akin to what is an apartheid state already in the US with the surveillance state on them. I wrote a piece on this several months ago on Muslim American apartheid, and today the FBI has more than 10,000 intelligence analysts and 15,000 paid informants dedicated to combating homegrown Muslim terrorism. Now, and I use the illustration that, given that there's an estimated 2.4 million Muslims living in America today, this would mean there's an FBI spy for every 94 Muslims living in the US. And if you put that into perspective, in East Germany, there was estimated to have been one Stasi agent for every 166 of its citizens. So, it's that kind of harassment. It's the infiltration by security forces. It's the baiting. We're seeing a lot of cases where it's the FBI themselves who are going into Muslim, communities and are doing the radicalization, giving the money for them to buy weapons, and then arresting them. The radicalization and the terrorist intended act would never have occurred if you hadn't have put in the FBI agent to whip up in the first place. So this is where, I find it really troubling that, we are committing already these social injustices.
Absolutely, and it's this isn't a new thing too.
Yeah.
I think is important to note. I mean, unfortunately the biggest, I think, consequence of September the 11th here in the United States was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which has an operating budget for the coming fiscal year just around $5 billion with a B dollars. That this is it was the largest restructuring of the American federal government since World War II with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And of course, the whole idea is to keep the homeland safe, and that's important. But when you have hundreds of thousands of people who work for an institution like that, when you have an institution like that with a budget, an operating budget of $5 billion, it in some ways locks you into a system where there has to be a threat, whether there's a threat or not. You're going to find one. You're going to, suppose that there is one, and so, yeah, and
sorry, go ahead.
No, and I was saying, and so you sort of get locked into this system that's very much like the military-industrial complex, where you can't get out of it. You've created a monster that's so big. In the wake of a tragedy, a real tragedy like 9/11, you create this monster that's so big to respond to it, that what you see result is exactly, a number of the things you described. The infiltration of Muslim communities here in the United States, where you have, the CIA, which cannot, by law, spy on American citizens, but let's face it, they do, teaming up with, the FBI and the New York Police Department to designate entire mosques as terrorist organizations, to send people, to send spies, to send moles on student-led camping trips, at universities, where they report things like, well, I was observing the students, and one young Muhammad prayed 5 times a day. Well, I mean, is this really damning information that is indicative of some terrorist threat? Or, as you say, intentionally sort of trapping, individuals who might sort of have a checkered past, might not be so sort of morally straight or squared. And
they have drug dependency, mental health issues, and they focus on these individuals because they believe they're easier to radicalize and get them to do, get them to catch them in the act of doing something, so they can brag that, they're actually being effective in fighting terror.
Absolutely. And, the clincher in all of this is what what has come of all of this money that we've spent on chasing down these supposed terrorists, these supposed cells that are operating, in our midst, amongst us? Nothing really. I mean, if you look at the whole New York Police Department fiasco, where the NYPD, as I just outlined, spied on the Muslim American community in Brooklyn and New Jersey and New York, and did extensive mapping. It's all available on the internet. It's really interesting stuff to look at. Where they'd roll by a Muslim-owned business and photograph it, and then they would include the information. Who was the owner? Did they sell halal food? What hours did they operate? They kept all of this. All of these documents. And in the end, what resulted from it? 0 arrests, 0 leads on terror or violence. Nothing came from it. And the New York Police Department, in concert with the CIA and the FBI, spent all of this money, exhausted all of these resources, all of these taxpayer dollars, and nothing in the end came of it. And that is, I think, very telling.
Oh, this is almost a form of internal state terrorism. And I mean, Arun Kundandi, who wrote "The Muslims Are Coming," which also looks in, Islamophobia in the wake of 9/11, he talks about the self-censorship now. Muslims, any Muslim living in America is used to the phone clicking, it being followed, their mosques being infiltrated with informants and so forth. And it makes Muslims retreat from any political discussion anymore. To be a moderate Muslim in America these days, a Muslim has to forget everything they know about, Palestine, Iraq, and the war on terror. And that becomes a form of self-censorship, which is a form of apartheid.
Well, absolutely. It's. I think in many ways, CJ, it's a way for the United States and its Western allies to sort of avoid having to deal with the reality that when it comes to wreaking havoc on places around the world, they win the day. They win the day every day. I mean, let's look at the Afghan war. Just a real tragedy, a real catastrophe. Certainly, I think that it was necessary to respond to the terrorist attacks 9/11. But, look at how that played out. I mean, look at the nightmare that became. It was a graveyard. They call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires, and it nearly became just that for the United States. But it certainly became a graveyard for innocent people of Afghanistan, 21,000 of whom it's estimated were killed as of February 2014. These are civilians. We're talking about. So 21,000 civilians. And then, look, we can go from country to country. The United States is Middle East playground, so to speak. I mean, and let's look at, the individuals and the countries that we support and the damage that they do in the world. I mean, during the latest assault on Gaza, 17 Palestinian journalists were killed by the Israeli army.
Yeah.
We don't hear about that, but we lose ourselves when the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo are attacked. We don't want to sort of confront the reality that the war in Syria has been really deadly for journalists too, with more than 150 killed, according to some estimates. In Iraq, right? I mean, let's not forget Iraq. It's estimated that upwards of 500,000 people have been killed. 500,000 people. I mean, that's an extraordinary number, and this is 500,000 people, according to the PLOS Medicine Journal, which did a study in concert with the University of Washington in Seattle. So, this is just to say that, by ramping up this idea that there's a threat at home and we need to kind of be aware of it and constantly be fighting it, we can avoid, I think, in a lot of ways, having to discuss the bad that we do in the world. And that's really a sad thing.
Yeah, James Risen talks about that in his latest book, Pay Any Price. And
Right.
And he just talks about what a behemoth the terrorism industrial complex he calls it now. And these, you've got what is it, something like 40 or 50% of these corporations which benefit from the war on terror now have directors who have been involved with fraud of $5 million or more. I mean, it's just opened up to every scandalous con man who sees an opportunity to win government, funded contracts just by whipping up the fear of Muslims. And I guess that's what I guess your book talks about. Is this is an industry? So explain what the industry looks like. Who gains the most? Who stands to gain the most by whipping up fear of Muslims?
Well, really, first of all, the industry isn't large. It's not like we're talking about the automobile industry, sort of on the whole here. This is really a small network of people that have created financially what very well could be an industry out of whipping up hatred, whipping up prejudice towards Muslims. So there are various elements of the Islamophobia industry. There are various groups and individuals that make it up. But let's just start with I think what's in the news and sort of what you led into the question with, sort of the terrorism, industrial complex, if you will, as it's been called, and how there are terrorism experts, for instance, like Steve Emerson, who's recently been in the news with his, I think, gaffe of the no-go zones in Europe, right? Right, yeah, and Bobby Jindal. So Bobby Jindal picks up on this and sort of apes what Steve Emerson says. And what a lot of people don't realize is that this is sort of the Islamophobia industry today. I mean, when you look at a figure like Steve Emerson, you think, well, there's this kind of kooky-looking fella on Fox News, and he's really tan, and for some reason he's got really, really bleached blonde hair, and he's got, terrorism expert scrolling across the screen at the bottom, and so, hey, he looks like kind of a modern contemporary figure, a bit odd of a guy, but, he's a terrorism expert, so we'll listen to him. Well, what they don't tell you is that the investigative project on terrorism is well-funded by some of the individuals and groups that you mentioned at the beginning of your of the segment here in your monologue, but also very closely allied with individuals like Daniel Pipes, one of the grandfathers of Islamophobia here in the United States, who runs the Middle East Forum, very closely associated with a whole host of sort of bloggers who serves an echo chamber for this. I mean, the whole no-go zone in Europe has been debunked now, but you have people like Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer running around the internet saying, well, it's actually a thing. But I think also, if you look at the blogosphere, it's really interesting there in terms of what they're able to do with sort of myths like this and how they're able to spin them. I mean, the whole myth over the so-called Ground Zero Mosque here in the United States, which, by the way, was not a mosque. It was not at Ground Zero. It was an Islamic community center, much like the YMCA. But that whole fiasco was basically manufactured by Pamela Geller, the same woman who is now in the news for her nasty anti-Muslim metro bus ads in San Francisco that were recently covered up with cartoons of Miss Marvel, a Muslim Pakistani-American sort of comic book hero who claims to take on hate. But the whole fiasco, I mean, you can imagine. This woman sits in her apartment, writes a blog about something called the Ground Zero Mosque. She's funded by various groups, various organizations. She makes up to $210,000 a year blogging for the American Freedom Defense Initiative. And with that money, she's able to do all sorts of harm in the world.
And she's guaranteed a spot on Fox News. And I mean, particularly this is that kind of Islamophobia. And Pam Geller, she's very much a Zionist. That's where I you've obviously got your neoconservatives who are looking to project American private enterprise into the Middle East, particularly big oil and the military-industrial complex, and then you've got the terror-industrial complex here to benefit from it. But a lot of it really does come from that, Israeli Hasbara, that Zionist view to demonize Muslims, to present Israel, besieged upon in the middle, surrounded by savages, and that gains a sympathetic ear from American audiences. So I put a lot of the blame at the feet squarely at the Israel pro-Israeli propaganda. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. You asked who has the most to gain, or what are the groups that have to gain from this in the Islamophobia industry, and groups that are closely knit, closely tied to Israel have an awful lot to gain, as you mentioned. I mean, let's look at sort of an example here. The group, the Clarion Fund, or the Clarion Project, as it's sometimes referred to in the United States, is a group that in 2008 distributed a film that they had produced called Obsession: Radical Islam's War with the West. And it was, a sort of scary looking flick about how Islam was supposedly going to take over the world. And there were a number of subsequent films that the Clarion Fund produced, one called Iranium, of course, a play there on the word uranium, and in Iran, and a few others. The thing is, though, CJ, the Clarion Fund does not exist. It's got an address in New York City. It's got a P.O. box, but it's one of these deals where you pay $75 a month and you can get, sort of a glossy looking business card that makes it appear as if you've got this, sort of upscale New York location. Meanwhile, there are two brothers in the occupied territories who are funneling money through their front group, Aish HaTorah, which means Fire of the Torah, to the United States to produce these films. So, for them, the idea is that if you can whip up the population in such an anti-Muslim frenzy ahead of, for instance, a big presidential election, as they tried to do in 2007, before, of course, Barack Obama defeated John McCain, their hope was, hey, look, if you can get the decorated war veteran who leans right politically in the White House, in terms of, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're more likely to gain ground with the guy that's sort of the decorated war veteran, Republican, sort of on our team when it comes to chanting, rah, rah, go Israel, rather than the sort of lefty, liberal, rookie politician Barack Obama, who, sat down and had dinner with Edward Said and claimed at the time that he would bring all of this change and warm and fuzzy feelings to the world. It didn't work out that way, but that's the kind of the depth of the pro-Israeli groups.
Yeah, no, you've been specifically tough on new atheists over the years, and which is something I like. I'm a reformed new atheist. I did consider myself a new atheist, and but the world is more complex than the banal bumper slogans that comes out of that particular echo chamber, and this is something that you wrote, and I want to see if this is how you still feel. You wrote this for Salon. You said, the new atheists became the new Islamophobes. Their invectives against Muslims resembling the rowdy, uneducated ramblings of backwards racists rather than appraisals based on intellect, rationality, and reason. I mean, as a piece of prose, that stands alone as magnificent.
Well, thanks. Look, I tell you that piece came out a couple of years ago, and in the years since, I have not changed my position. And I have to tell you, I think that there are more and more examples of exactly what I was talking about. I mean, Bill Maher did a great service to that argument that I advanced, and others have written about it, including Glenn Greenwald, Murtaza Hussain, more recently Reza Aslan. But yeah, the thing is, their arguments do resemble sort of the ramblings of backwood racists. They're unintelligent, they're illogical, they're not really informed. They harp on these sort of snarky lines like, well, Islam isn't really a race, so I'm not a racist. They have these things that they repeat over and over and over again, and they just can't seem to get the idea that what they're saying does a lot of harm to a lot of Muslims, or has the potential to do a lot of harm to a lot of Muslims around the world, because they're not really nuanced in their views. They're attacking Islam, but what they can't quite see, number one, is that Islam doesn't act. Islam doesn't have any agency. Islam can't be peaceful or nor can it be violent. Islam is just a set of collected religious beliefs, but those religious beliefs, that collected set of beliefs, forms the identities of 1.6 billion people around the world. Not all of those identities are the same. So the idea that because you're a Muslim, everything that's written in the Quran is what you believe, and you all sort of operate in lockstep according to the teachings of the Quran is silly. It's as silly as saying that I don't know, progressive Christians and the far right sort of nuts like the former Jerry Falwell or the sort of nut du jour Pat Robertson of CBN all sort of believe the same thing because we all read the Bible.
It's like saying MLK and Fred Phelps from the Westboro Baptist Church occupy the same space. It's
precisely,
and that's what New Atheism does. It kind of reduces each religious believer to the worst aspect of their religious text. So if the Bible says stone somebody to death for adultery, then every Christian is a stone throwing adulterer killer. And that's the danger of it. They kind of, in a way, they interpret their religious text in the same way that religious extremists do. But that's
absolutely
not. People are more nuanced and sophisticated and complex than that. They're not one-dimensional cartoon characters at all.
No, absolutely. And I think it was Noam Chomsky that referred to them in the past as sort of fundamentalists in that way. I don't like to really use the term fundamentalism. There's a lot of complexities there, but in the way that it's generally used, I think, and generally understood in society, they really are. They're individuals that sort of are a mirror image of the extremists of the world.
Well, and what's made them dangerous is their popularity. And they are becoming increasingly popular. And you wrote to this, or you spoke to that point. You said, and I'm quote you, said the power of these new atheist provocations is their ability to reach popular audiences and move their geeky discussions from lecture halls and libraries to the sets of The Daily Show and The Colbert Report, where hipsters and yuppies alike digest their sardonic sound bites, repeating them to their online networks in 140 characters or less. And that's if you're on Twitter. I follow a lot of new atheists on Twitter. It's just these idiotic, incoherent, demonization of anyone who's religious. Religion's a virus. You're mentally disordered if you're a believer, and all this type of stuff. And it really is ugly business. And as you said, they don't realize the disservice and also the danger of their provocations. I believe it's a concern.
Yeah, Reza Aslan, the author Reza Aslan, recently said something that I think is very true. In fact, he wrote it in an op-ed, though I've forgotten which outlet at the moment. But he said, the sort of new atheists today, as we talk about them, aren't really atheists in so much as they are anti-theists.
Yeah.
Anti-theists. And that was a really important point because, can't it be the case that these individuals hold the beliefs that they do about the world and not feel the desire to antagonize other people over the beliefs that they hold? I mean, is it not good enough to simply, not believe in the existence of a God? I mean, must you feel compelled to then, sort of berate people and belittle people and beat people over the head with your own sort of, I don't know, I guess it wouldn't be a Bible, but what would it be? Your own sort of anti-holy book. It's not good enough for them. They're sort of on this campaign to show the world how smart they are, and at the same time how stupid everyone else who doesn't believe just like them is.
No, exactly, and also too, in light of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, what I find concerning, and this is not just for New Atheists, it's just the media in general, is we harp on the religious fanatical aspect of the terrorists, and that's a way of demonizing Muslims at large. So when the Kouachi brothers killed the workers at Charlie Hebdo, we focus on their Islamic beliefs. We focused on the blasphemy aspect of the cartoons, but nobody seems to want to talk about the political grievances, because if you talk about the political grievances, it means self-examination or introspection. And the Islamophobes, have done such a good job of keeping all of that kind of discussion out of media and focusing exclusively on religion, which is becoming self-defeating in trying to combat terrorism.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the Charlie Hebdo killings were not, absolutely not, about free speech. The
No.
Charlie Hebdo killings were not really even about cartoons. But this is what we latch onto.
But if you say that to an American, or you say that, they'll want to bash you up for saying it. They'll think you're an absolute idiot. What they shouted Allah Akbar, and they'll say, "What more evidence do you need?" They shouted Allah Akbar, and they said because there's a blasphemy against the Prophet Muhammad, but it had nothing to do with it. It's a symbol. They see it as a symbolism of Western oppression. That's
Right. It's I think because, as you say, people have a difficult time being self-critical. We have a difficult time looking at ourselves and asking the tough question: what did we do as a society, as a world, to engender this sort of thing? I mean, it's sort of this air of self-righteousness, I think, that a lot of people have. But look, let's be very clear about something. The Charlie Hebdo attacks were not about free speech. They were not about cartoons. The Boston bombings 2 years ago in the United States were not about, religion. There was no sort of religious reasoning behind it. Religion may have been something that the Tsarnaev brothers latched onto in the end as a way to make themselves sort of feel good about what they're doing. But let's be clear. When Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was in Watertown, hiding out in the boat before he was found and captured, he wrote very clearly a message that said, the United States government is killing our innocent civilians. Most of you already know that, though. I can't stand to see this evil in the world go unpunished. So clearly for him, the reason that he and his brother did what they did, it's not justification. It's not right. It doesn't make what they did right. But their reasoning behind it was that they viewed the United States military actions abroad as harmful. And they wanted to retaliate. They wanted to fight back against that. I mean, let's look at a figure as sort of notorious as Osama bin Laden. Everyone thinks that Osama bin Laden was this sort of a religious figure that was very sort of, one-track mind. He thought only about religion. He was sort of a pious Muslim, and he wanted to blow up the world. The reality, though, if you look at the writings of Osama bin Laden, if you study them, if you read them, what you see is that Osama bin Laden wrote, in fact, there's a wonderful book called Messages to the World, which is a collection of his writings. It's edited by Bruce Lawrence, professor at Duke, or former professor at Duke. And he wrote in one of the speeches called A Message to the World, he said, "You ask, why do we hate you? Here is why we hate you." And he enumerated all of the things that the United States, in his mind, was responsible for. Responsible for foreign invasion, occupation of Muslim majority countries around the world. I mean, the vast majority of the things he listed were political. The last point I want to make real quick is this: since 1980, the United States has invaded, bombed, or occupied 14 Muslim majority countries. And I think we ought to take a moment as Americans, as Europeans, as others, as Australians, to sort of think about that. I mean, the idea that in the span of 34 years, the United States government has invaded, bombed, or occupied 14 Muslim majority countries. Do we really think that there's not going to be some kind of blowback from that? Do we really think that these groups and individuals that pop up around the world and wreak havoc on us from time to time here at home are just springing up out of nowhere? That they're not the result of this catastrophe that we are responsible for?
Chris Hedges asked the same thing. He says, "Do you really believe that Arabs in Gaza in an open air prison, they don't see the markings on the fragmentation bomb saying "Made in Dayton, Ohio." I mean, it's not just the actual bombing itself. It's also we're arming these autocratic regimes, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia to Yemen, and so we can plunder the country's natural resources. So even indirectly, we oppress Muslims through our foreign policy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole situation, I think, now in Syria is just really it's just really sad. And the fact that the United States and Europe, various countries in Europe, at one point were kind of weighing their options. What are we going to do with Bashar al-Assad? And now we've sort of reached this point where things have gone on long enough that there's talk about including Assad in sort of whatever talks come to fruition regarding stability in the region, and that says a lot to a lot of people in Syria and around the world who have suffered at his hands for an awful long time.
Yeah, yeah. It was interesting. I had Moazem Beg on here last week on the program, and he was talking about we were talking about the radicalization of Arabs and Muslims, and he made the point that there was a guard at Gitmo that said to him, he said, if I wasn't a terrorist before I was put here, I would be a terrorist after I left,
Right.
And then he also made the point from that 17 of ISIS's top leadership were all tortured at Camp Bukka in Iraq. So we refuse to look at the cause and effect and the link of terrorism, which is very dangerous. Mate, we've gone well over and truly over time, Nathan. This has been mate, very enlightening. Where's the best place my listeners can find your book?
Well, they can order a copy of it on Amazon for sure. They can visit my website, which is nathanlean.com, or they can follow me on Twitter at nathanlean.
Oh, mate, terrific. Mate, thanks for the chat.
Thank you so much, CJ.
All the best, mate. I look forward to chatting you soon.
Great. Take care.
You too. Cheers, buddy.
Bye.